In the earlier video, we have understood the different terms of performance testing. Now, we'll try to understand the different types of performance testing. Okay? There are quite a few. Okay? To be precise, there are 5. So let's start with the first one, which is the load test or load testing. This is the very important test that you have to do as a performance tester, guys, and it's a mandatory test. You cannot skip this test. Let's try to understand why is this important and what it means. So let's assume your application. Let's go back to our same application, which is Amazon.in. And the peak hour for Amazon.in, let's say, is around 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Okay? The peak hour as in the more number of users are coming to this application around this time or around this hour, which is 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Let's assume there are 1,000 concurrent users. Okay? I have already told you what is concurrent users. Let's say during this peak hour from 5 to 6 p.m. the number of concurrent users are, let's say, is 1,000. Why we are saying this peak hour? Which means that in any other hour, the load on the application will be little less. In other words, let's say from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. the number of users could be 900, which is less than 1,000. So in any other hour, it is less than this peak hour, or it is less than this 1,000. That is the reason why we are calling this as a peak hour. That's when the business, this Amazon.in, is going at a full pace. Okay, so during this peak hour, the user load is 1,000. So as a performance tester, we have to test this application, which is Amazon.in, with this 1,000 user load. So the process of testing this with the peak load is what we call it as load testing. For example, if the response times are good for during this peak hour, then you can guarantee your client saying that, oh, go ahead and deploy this application. It will certainly work fine during the peak hour. So this is one of the reasons why we do the load testing, and it's a mandatory test. Only if this test passes, then we go ahead and do the other test. Let's try to understand this load testing using this workload graph. Let's say on the x-axis you have the elapsed time, or in other words, how long you're running your test. On the y-axis you have number of these concurrent users or virtual users. So for the load testing, you slowly ramp up until you reach that 1,000. In our example, we kind of taken it that the user load for that peak hour is 1,000. So we're gonna ramp up until we reach that 1,000. And once we reach that 1,000, you run a steady state test. This is usually for 1 hour for most of the companies when we do the load testing. For some companies, I've seen that they will be running it for 2 hours or 3 hours as well. There is no industry standard, but most of the projects that I was involved with, it used to run for 1 hour. Now, after 1 hour, you slowly ramp down. So this 1 hour test is what we call it as a steady state test. This is what we call it as a ramp down, and this is what we call it as a ramp up. So this 1 hour test is run with this 1,000 concurrent users, which refers to the peak load. So this is what is usually a load testing is, and this is how a load testing is done. Now, as you can see, I came out with this sample scenario. Okay, let's assume our project is a Mercury project. So the test that you are doing is the load test. And what is the duration of this test? Typically, it's 1 hour. And look at the objective of the load test typically. Okay, what is the objective? To simulate the peak load and to monitor the performance of that particular application. Okay, so when we simulate the peak load, as in the load during the peak hour, then we will monitor the application whether the performance is good or bad. That is the whole objective of this doing the load test. And steps, the online load will be maintained at a steady state for 1 hour for only critical performance testing application transactions. Okay, here we are doing it for 1 hour, but it totally depends upon your company. What I have worked is, I've worked across multiple projects for multiple companies. Typically it will be run for 1 hour. And what is the entry criteria for this test? All the monitors are in place. Second thing is, the whole test data is done properly and there will not be any issues when you're running the test. And finally, the shakedown test is completed successfully, or there will be a prior to this actual test, there will be a mock test that will be done just to make sure that the environment is good, the scripts is good and the tool is good, everything is good. We do a shakedown test or a mock test sort of thing. Once that is passed, then we actually run the load test. And finally, the exit criteria, when the response times meet the SLA. SLA is the service level agreements, so your response times are good or within the limits of that SLA that the client has given to you. And finally, the test completion report is done by you and is agreed by your client or your stakeholders. This is what a sample scenario of a load test looks like. Now, we will look at the second test, which is the stress test. As I've told you before, once you are done with the load test and the response times for the load test is good, this is when you go ahead and execute the other test, okay, which is the stress test. As the name suggests, it is stressing something. It is stressing something. What is that it is stressing? It is stressing the application. Whatever the application and the test, you're applying so much load on the application that it will stress it and finally it will break it as well. The idea for doing the stress test is to identify that breaking point as to when the application breaks. So for doing the stress test, we will have a look at that workload graph again for this. So we'll go back to the same graph. On the x-axis, you have the elapsed time. On the y-axis, you have number of concurrent users or number of virtual users. So as a part of stress test, what do? You keep increasing, you keep ramping up. There is no steady state, there is no ramp down over here. There is just a ramp up. You keep increasing the load. Let's say this is the 1000 mark, okay? This is when the peak load is. After the peak load is reached, you keep increasing the load. You keep increasing the load until the system breaks. At some point of time, your application, which is Amazon.in, cannot take any more requests or cannot take any more user load. This is when the system breaks, and the whole idea of doing the stress test is to identify that breaking point. So once the breaking point is identified, then you can say that your stress test is done and that breaking point, let's say the breaking point is 2500 users. So this is the number that you give to the client saying that your system will break at 2500 users. Until 2500 users, the server's not going to go down and the system will not break. This is what you will be telling to the client after you have executed the stress test. Now, there is one more test called spike test. Typically, the spike test is what they call it is a subset of the stress test. Okay, what is that? It's a subset of the stress test. As you can see, it is done by increasing the user load beyond the anticipated load for a short period of time. What is the anticipated load for us here? The anticipated load is the 1000 users. So you're gonna apply the load more than this anticipated load for a very short period of time. Okay. So the spike test will be something like this. So this is the anticipated load. You are going over the anticipated load for a short period of time just to see what happens with the system. So spike test is rarely done. In fact, in my projects, I have a illustrative career of 7 years. In my 7 years, I have done the spike test only once. But stress test is done quite often in your projects. And stress test is done after your load test. Now, let's look at the scenarios for the stress test, how it will be implemented in the real-time projects. As you can see here, the scenario name is stress test, and the duration, it is not applicable because we don't know when is the breaking point. So you keep increasing it until you identify the breaking point. That is the reason why we don't know how long we're going to execute this test. And the objective is to verify the application can handle the projection growth and to discover the breaking point. You see here, to discover the breaking point. That's our objective. So steps: ramp up to 150% of the peak load. This is what I have done for one of the project, but you can ramp it up to 300% or 400% or 500% as to whatever you think that you can find the breaking point at. Okay, and thereafter continuously increase the load until the breaking point is found. And entry criteria means when we can start the test. When we can start the test? When all the monitors are in place, when the test data is done. Obviously, if you have the test data, then only you can do the execution. And finally, the peak load test is completed successfully. Only then you can start this stress test. And what is the exit criteria, guys? You create the completion report and make sure you get it a sign off from your client. This is what a stress test for you, and my little example over here probably would have helped you understand this stress test better. Now we're going to look at the third test, which is, we call it as an endurance test. Some of the people would like to call this as soak test. In fact, I used to call this soak test all the time. Most of my colleagues used to call this as a soak test all the time. So whether you can call it as an endurance test or a soak test, it's one of the same. So what is this endurance test? So soaking or endurance, what is that word significance? Soaking you do it for longer period of times, right? You soak the clothes for a longer period of times. Here also the soak test you run for a longer period of times. The load test it will be run for only 1 hour, but the soak test will be run for 8 hours, 1 day, sometimes 2 days, or sometimes even 3 days. It totally depends upon the client. Most of the clients that I worked with, we used to run, they are happy with the 8 hours test. But some of my friends, they run the soak test for 24 hours. Even few of my colleagues from other projects, they used to run it for 3 hours, 3 days. That's what their client wanted. But 8 hours is a good enough time. And why you want to run this test for a longer period of time? To identify if there is any issues when you run it for a longer period of time. Or in other words, if this application is stable or not is something that you want to identify when you want to run the endurance test. Let's look at that workload graph again for this endurance test to understand this better. So going back over to our graph, again on the x-axis we have the same thing, which is elapsed time, and on the y-axis you have number of virtual users. Okay, so here we have a ramp up as we had with the load test. So it will be increased. Let's say the peak load user load is 1000. So usually we don't run this test with 1000 users, maybe 700 or 500 depending upon how you have set the expectations to the client. I used to run it with 70% of the load, so this will be 700. So once you reach the 700 user load, you run for a longer period of time. Okay, not for 1 hour, but typically 8 hours. Okay, and once you are done with the test, as usual, you ramp it down. So what is the difference between a load test and a endurance test? First is you don't run it with the peak load, you run it with 70% of the peak load or 50% of the peak load. Second thing is you run it for a longer period of times. 8 hours is good enough, but if your client wanted it for 1 day or 3 days, do it appropriately. And then you have a ramp down. So here, what is that we are doing? When we run the test for a longer period of times, is my application stable? Are there any other issues coming up after 6 hours or after 7 hours or during that 8th hour? This is what you want to uncover. Typically, the issues that you want to identify when you run the endurance test is memory leaks or connection leaks. This is very, very important, guys. If there are memory leaks in your application, and if you're not doing the endurance test, and if they're not identified, then once the application is deployed into production, over a period of time, the performance goes down. In other words, the first day, the performance is good after you have deployed, but after a month, the performance goes down. So this is very, very bad. Okay, so let's look at the scenario for this. See my little example. Again, I have taken the Mercury project itself. Let's say that's my project, and I have created a scenario for that. So the name is the soak test. I have run it for 8 hours. So that could be 24 hours or 3 days. And what is the objective of this? To discover the memory leaks. Okay, that is one of the important thing that we wanted to identify using this. And the steps, you see, you have a ramp up and you have a steady state test for 8 hours. And entry criteria, as with others, the entry criteria is same. The monitors is in place. The test data, this is important, guys. So if you're running it for 3 days, you have to have enough test data so that the test goes for 3 days. Most of the times you don't put enough test data. The test will run for 2 days, and after 2 days there is no more data, so the test will be stopped or failed. So your 2 days of effort is gone waste. So make sure the test data is all set up when you start this soak test or endurance test. The entry criteria. As with the other test, the monitors has to be in place, and the test data, this is very, very important. Especially if you have decided to run the soak test for 3 days or 2 days, this test data is very, very important. I have seen some of the tests wherein there is only enough data so that the test could run for 1 day. Then after a day or two, the test will stop because you don't have enough test data, which means that you have to do the test all over again. So which means that you have wasted 2 days. So this is one of the important things that you want to check when you are running an endurance test or a soak test. And the third one is, this has to be done after the load test is done. The load test is the mandatory thing. Only after that is done, you wanted to do any other test. The exit criteria, as with others, the completion report has to be created by you, and finally that has to be signed off or agreed by your stakeholders or the clients. So that's what is an endurance test for you guys. Now we will move on to the next test. Scalability test. Okay, you go back to our definition of performance testing, guys. As per the definition of performance testing, testing an application for speed, stability and scalability. That's what is performance testing. So the load test will take off speed, the endurance test will take care of the stability, and the scalability test obviously takes care of the scalability. The scalability is nothing but the future growth. Okay, right now for the peak load, for this Amazon application, during the peak hour, you have 1000 concurrent users. Okay, we have assumed that. Okay, like 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. That's your peak hour. During that peak hour, the peak load is 1000 concurrent users. That's what it is there at this point of time. But 6 months down the lane, during this peak hour, it will not be 1000. It could be more. If the application is doing good, it could be more after 6 months from now. Okay, it could be maybe 1500. So your load test, which is done with 1000 user load, will not be of any good after 6 months from now. So this is the reason why you have to do a scalability test. So the scalability test, even though you are doing now, you're not doing with 1000 user load, but you will be doing with 1500 user load. So whatever the test that you do with this 1500 user load, that's what is a scalability test. Again, it's not a mandatory test, guys. Only if the client wants it, typically we run the scalability test. Let's look at the workload graph for this scalability test so that you can understand this better. So again, on the x-axis, you have the elapsed time, and on the y-axis, you have the number of concurrent users or the virtual users. So for the scalability test, you ramp it up to that 1500, assuming that after 6 months, during the peak hour, the load will be 1500. And once you reach that 1500 point, you run a steady state test for 1 hour, and then after 1 hour you ramp down. This is what is the scalability test. So I will superimpose the load test on that so that you can clearly compare both of them. So if it was a load test, again you ramp it up, but you ramp it up here to only 1000 because that's what is the peak load at this point of time. So once you reach 1000, you run a steady state test for 1 hour and then you ramp down. But this one is 1000 users and this one is 1500 users. That's the only difference between the load test and the scalability test. Scalability test, as I've told you guys, it's not a mandatory test. If you have time, then you can go ahead and execute the scalability test because it will happen 6 months from now, not at this point of time. Now, let's look at the last test in the types of performance testing, which is the volume test. Some of the people would like to call this as a database test or in other words, but for our performance testing, we call this as a volume test. The volume test, I'll tell you guys, it's exactly like your load test. Like, let's assume the peak load or the user load is 1000 concurrent users. You run a load test with 1000 users, okay, assuming that this is 1000, okay, and this is the elapsed time. So volume test is done the same thing, okay. You ramp up with the same speed, you run it for 1 hour with the same 1000 users and you ramp down. So what is the difference between the load test and the volume test then? The only difference, guys, is in the database. In the database, for the load test, you put whatever is required. The data, whatever is required, you keep that kind of data or you put that kind of data in the database. But for the volume test, you put lot more data that you expect over the period of years. Like, let's say you have deployed the application the very first time today. Slowly the number of users getting registered will increase, the number of transactions will increase, which means that your database grows over a period of time. So that's what you want to simulate. So when you do the volume testing, purposefully you put more data in the database or you make sure that the database grows, and with that kind of database you run the test, the same load test. The idea is, since the data in the database is increased, will it affect the response times or will it affect the performance of the application is what I want to check with the volume test. So we have seen all the 5 tests that is required, guys: the load test, stress test, endurance test, scalability test, and finally the volume test. With this, the types of performance testing is done.